You know, it's an unfortunate thing that some opponents to the Bible believe that as Christians, when we come to the church building door, we check our brain at it. And we're not thinking anymore. We're just blindly accepting what some guy up front says. We're just blindly accepting what some aged book filled with fairy tales says. And now we just go off it with no thought at all. But if people believe that, they forget something. We worship a God who created the brain. We worship a God who created the brain. The brain was made for thinking. Yeah. The brain was made for thinking. The brain was made for thought. The brain was made for analyzing. It is okay to take critical thinking skills and apply it to the Bible. In fact, it's encouraged. And I would encourage you to do it. What is critical thinking skills? But, there's actually a community for the critical thinking. And they describe it this way. It says, the definition of critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process of activity and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and/or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. In its exemplary form, it is based on universal intellectual values that transcend subject matter divisions, clarity, accuracy, precision, consistency, relevance, and evidence, good reason, depth, breadth, and fairness. There you go. There's your mental gymnastics for today. This is what critical thinking is, as some people describe it. And again, it is okay to apply it to the Bible. In fact, it is encouraged. I would encourage you, don't just read the Bible, wrestle with it. Wrestle with it. We'll grow if we do. That's the power behind it. It's been an interesting week. Over the past month or so, I was reading the book, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. And if you don't know his story, he was a journalist, a courtroom journalist from Chicago, who has a law degree from Harvard. So, he's not just some hayseed. And he was an avowed atheist. And his wife became a Christian. And this really irritated him to no end. The type of atheism he followed was hedonism. He wanted to do what he wanted to do. That was it. And so out of anger and out of spite, because it drove him nuts that his wife had the audacity to join a cult, he said, okay, I'm going to take Christ and I'm going to pursue Him like I would pursue any other court case. I'm going to follow the evidence. After all, that was one of his big things. I follow facts. I follow reality. Christianity is a myth. It is a legend. And so, again, despite his wife, he sought out to disprove Christ. And in the Case for Christ, it's made up of conversations between Lee Strobel and various types of experts. Archaeologists, psychologists, Greek, Hebrew scholars, historians, commentators, medical doctors. Because one of the arguments that he had to track down was, did Jesus actually die on the cross? So I'll finish that book, and if you're an avid reader like me, you know how it went. It was about midnight, and I still had 50 pages to go. So did I put my book down and set it aside until tomorrow where I could finish it? No, I continued reading until 2 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, what? Sleep? I'll do it later. But also this week, a group of us from here went out and saw the movie. It's at the Cinemark 6. And also, diving into the suggestion box, I pull out a card that says, Are there any evidences for the resurrection? So I was like, yeah! Let me share you some. Because that's the thing. That's the big ticket item. Is there proof for a resurrection? Yes. Short answer. Yeah, there is. But also, why do we have to ask that? Well, because let's think about it for a minute. Again, critical thinking. What do Christians have if there wasn't a resurrection of Jesus? If Jesus was never raised on the cross, what would that mean for us? That's everything. If there's no resurrection, there's no Messiah. There's no hope. That's it. It's done. Jesus is a liar. We can all go back to our knitting. Nothing to see here. Because, that was part of His message. See, this is how some people look at it. This is how some people look at the Bible. They say the Bible and they say, okay, you follow this book, this book that was written by men lie. It says, so if you just have a Bible, that's proof that God exists. Well, I have a comic book of Spider-Man, so that proves Spider-Man exists. And that's as deep as the thinking goes. And if this is where you are, I would encourage you. Research it. Follow the evidence. See where it takes you. Because historians will say there is more, way more proof, evidences of the validity of the Bible than any other historical document we have. Not by a little, but by hundreds of percent. Again, the resurrection. Was Jesus raised from the dead? That was part of the message. Matthew chapter 12, verse 40. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Mark chapter 8, verse 31. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and then that He must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Luke chapter 18, verses 32 and 33. He will be delivered over to the Gentiles. They will mock Him, insult Him, and spit on Him. They will flog Him and kill Him. On the third day He will rise again. John chapter 2, verse 19. Jesus answered them, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. The resurrection was part of His message. The resurrection was supposed to be another sign of who He is. And if Jesus was not raised from the dead, again, we have nothing. So that's how come it's attacked. Jesus never raised from the dead. But what we're going to briefly go through today are some proofs, some evidences, some critical thinking exercises of whether or not Jesus did indeed rise from the dead. And again, as we go through this, and if you're a spot where you're not quite sure you put your faith in Jesus rising from the dead or not, listen to what we're talking about this morning. But again, don't stop here. Research it. It's that important. Research it. Search it out. Go on a truth journey and see what you find. Let's kick this off. 1, the empty tomb. You realize how big of a proof that actually is? The window of shutting Christianity down was at the very beginning of it. And what I mean is this. On the third day, the ladies wake up and they go to the tomb. We'll talk more about them in a minute. But they go to the tomb and again, the body's not there. All anybody had to do in order to shut the belief of Jesus down was to present the body. All they needed to have was a body. And that would have shut everybody up. But there was no body. Where did the body go? Now, if you go back and you look at what the opponents of Jesus, the enemies of Jesus try to say, not just in the Bible, but also in the Talmuds and the Jewish writings, nobody says, nobody, not even the enemies of Christ, say the body was in the tomb and they just missed it. The one unifying fact is that the body is gone. Again, all they had to do to shut everybody up was to present the body, but there's no body there. Well, then the other thought is, well, someone stole the body. Okay, who? Who would have stolen the body? The Jews and the Romans? They have no motive. Why would the Jews want to help them in their own idea that Jesus resurrected from the dead by taking the body? They have no motive. The Romans at this time, they didn't care. They could have cared less what was going on in this situation. The disciples? Yeah, that's the other thought. Well, the disciples stole the body. No. They were too scared to. Remember, at this point, they're hiding. They kind of wash their hands of the mission of Jesus until Jesus appears to them later. They're not going to steal the body. Some try to say, and I love this, have you ever heard a joke about ladies getting lost and not knowing directions? Well, that's what historians say about these ladies. They went to the wrong tomb. They went to the wrong tomb. Okay, think about that. They went to the wrong tomb. Okay. Well, if they went to the wrong tomb and it was empty and they went back and said, Jesus raised from the dead, can you imagine how many members of the Sanhedrin and others would say, no. You went to the wrong tomb. Here is the tomb of Jesus. That quick. To this day, no critic has been able to produce the body of Jesus. Earliest Jewish argument against Christianity still admit the tomb was empty. This is positive evidence from hostile witnesses. They can say many things, but what they cannot say is that the tomb was occupied. They have to say the tomb was empty. But that's just one. It is powerful. It's powerful. Anybody say, well, Jesus didn't raise from the dead. Okay, where's the body? You got to produce the body if you're going to say it. The first eyewitnesses to the resurrection were women. Now, I'm not a sexist, but this was a sexist society that they lived in. Women testimony was not allowed in courts. Okay, well, let's think about this. If you're going to make this up, if you're going to sit down and write, this is how Jesus was raised from the dead, and you're totally making it up from your own imagination, who would you put down as the first eyewitnesses? Most likely, someone credible. Someone that the vast majority of people would listen to just because of either who they were, what station they had, or what title they had. You would not use testimony that would not even have been allowed in court. That's ludicrous thinking. The fact that the writers wrote how Jesus appeared to the women first helps to show their honesty to the events as they happened. They kept it that way because that's what happened. Even though to some reading it for the first time in that day and age would be like, what? No. But they had every reason in the world to change it, but they didn't because they wanted to keep track of the truth of it. Post-resurrection courage. We talked about the disciples earlier. These disciples who were, again, remember Peter, even if you have to die, I'll die there with you. Yeah, Jesus is arrested. They tuck tail and run. Judas hangs himself earlier. John's the only one to witness the crucifixion of Jesus. The rest are in hiding. They're in hiding because they did not want to go through it the way they thought they did. When push came to shove, they ran. One of the most uncomfortable verses of the Bible for me, and when I read it I just cringe, is in the gospel accounts when Peter is denying Jesus 3 times, and I believe it's Luke who says on the third one, Jesus, who's on one side of this great area and Peter's on the other, Jesus turns his head and locks eyes with Peter on that third denial, and then the rooster crows, and then he goes off and he weeps bitterly. Could you imagine? Oh. But then 50 days later, 50 days later, on the day of Pentecost, Peter and the rest stand out and they start proclaiming Jesus very publicly and very courageously. And then, on top of that, they're willing to face prison. They're willing to face beatings. And every single one of them will face some sort of martyrdom. What happened in a very small amount of time? What did they experience? What did they see? They saw the resurrected Lord. Keep these guys on the back of your head. We'll come back to them. Consider the change in James. We talked a little bit about this earlier in our class. In John chapter 7, verse 5, it says, "For even his own brothers did not believe in him." This is talking about Jesus' family. Jesus, when he walked to earth, he did not have the support of his family outside of mom. The rest of his brothers, they didn't believe in him. John 7 is actually an interesting chapter. They're kind of egging him on and saying, well, you know, anybody who wants to make a name for himself will go to a festival where people are so that they can get more people to follow him. Duh! That's the way it works. This is showbiz. You got to get your name out there. They did not believe in who he was. But something happened. Something happened to James. And we get it in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. But if you jump down to... what did I do? Did I do that? Well. You just can't have nice things. All right. It says, then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Before Jesus appeared to the other disciples, they were called apostles at the time, he appears to James. James sees him. And then he has his moment. And this wasn't some little small eureka moment. James will later go on to become one of the leaders of the Church of Jerusalem. And then James would later go on and be stoned to death. One version of his death says that he was at the top of the temple and he was still proclaiming Jesus, and then he's shoved from the top of the temple, lands, survives that, then he's stoned for a bit, survives that, and then someone clubs him on the back of the head, finally killing him. From non-believer to someone who's willing to experience a painful death for Jesus. Again, like that. Why? Because he saw his resurrected Lord. What about the large crowd of eyewitnesses? You know, again, and it was read earlier, but 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 3. Listen to what this says. It says, "For what I receive I pass on to you as of first importance." Now notice the colon. Now after this colon, you know, that's where we have the part that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that He was buried and He was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that He appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that He appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then He appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last He appeared to me. This is not something that Paul came up with to write to the Corinthians. This was a creed. This was a series of beliefs. This is a series of evidence that some historians say that the Christians started to say mere months after Jesus was raised from the dead. 1 Corinthians is believed to have written about AD 55. But the creed itself, by the time that Paul wrote this, a couple of decades old. Mere months. Now, we're 2,000 years after these events. But imagine going back in time. And again, look at what Paul said. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. What does this mean? This means that if you were alive back in the time, you could go and talk to people who saw the resurrected Jesus. You could talk to them. This wasn't some legend. This wasn't some myth. This was eyewitness accounts. Then you could go and talk to these people. And today we say, yeah, but that didn't happen. Again, remember, once upon a time, every letter in this Bible was new. Which means that if someone read it and they didn't believe it, all they had to do was investigate it, and it would have been quick. It wouldn't have taken any time for people to say, yeah, I was there, I didn't see anything. But that's not what they said. They said they saw the resurrected Lord. They eyewitnessed it. So many ways the story of the raised Christ could have been shut down by the people who are living in that day. All they had to do was produce a body, say they didn't see Him, and just live their lives. But they didn't. They instead passed on this story, sharing people how powerful this is. Jesus appeared to them. But of course, people have their theories. Some people say, well, no. That's not what happened. It was a group hallucination. That's a popular one. Group hallucination. I don't know what you know about hallucinations or not. Group hallucinations is believed to be a myth. Let's see, I thought I saw Alma. Alma, you're here. Alma Tovar and Araceli Alanis could go to the, they're both trying to be nurses. They could go to the pharmacy and get a whole bunch of groovy drugs and spike the communion trays. Okay, too many of you are smiling at that possibility. And induce hallucinations in us. But this is the thing. We wouldn't have the same one. We would all hallucinate differently. Just like I can come in today and say, I had a bad dream. What do you think are the odds are that somebody else would say, yeah, I had that same dream without me saying a word about it? Group hallucinations do not exist. They don't work. Some other people say, and they like to talk about this with the miracles, for examples. Okay, fine. Individual hypnosis. Again, no. Because hypnosis does not work that way. A hypnotist can stand in front of a great crowd of people and seek to hypnotize them, and only a few would actually be hypnotized. Why? Because you have to be of a certain inclination in order to be hypnotized in the first place. One of the things in which you need to have in a person in order to be hypnotized is willingness. They need to be willing to be hypnotized in the first place. Well, what does that mean? Remember James? From doubter to believer. We're about to talk about Saul to Paul. These guys were not willing. They didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to know anything about it. But yet, they changed. It wasn't hypnosis. It wasn't a group hallucination. It wasn't anything like that. This was based on eyewitness accounts in which you could go back and hunt people up and ask them point blank, what did you see that day? And they would tell you. Let's talk about Saul. How does the guy who stood approving of Stephen's execution then become a person who's going to be executed for proclaiming the gospel himself? How does that happen? How does that work? Again, he wasn't willing. He wasn't willing, but he wasn't standing up. I want to be a volunteer. When someone stood up and said, may I have a volunteer so that I may hypnotize you into saying that you saw the resurrected Lord. Saul was an aggressive persecutor of the church. He imprisoned, he killed. And then he's going to become an impassioned missionary for Christ over a trip to Damascus. Very short period of time. But it's more than that. Look at what these people went through. He endured 5 floggings, 3 beatings, shipwrecks, a stoning, poverty, and years of ridicule. Finally, the Roman Emperor Nero had Paul beheaded because he was an apostle who refused to deny his faith in Jesus. Now, some of you might be thinking, there's a lot of people today who are willing to die for their faith. But there's a difference between what we're talking about this morning and people today. And that difference is, these aren't people who just have a blind faith about Christ. These are people who say they have seen Him. Their activities are based on their witness. Case in point. The Mormons. Started by a guy named Joseph Smith. Long story short, Joseph Smith is a guy who believed that in upstate New York that the angel Moroni, which I always laugh because I'm glad he threw that extra I on there. You take the I away from Moroni, you get moron. Spelling humor is fun. Gave him gold discs and a set of goggles so that he could translate the gold disc into what is now the Book of Mormon. Now, if you pick up a Book of Mormon, in one of the front pages, they have a list of witnesses. They have a list of witnesses who say they saw the golden plates and the goggles and everything else that Joseph Smith had in order to translate the discs. There's a set of witnesses, and they put their names down. But then here's the kicker. Every single one of those guys died outside of the Mormon faith. Every single one. People might be willing to spread a lie. People might be willing to live a lie. But how many people do you know, are you yourself willing to die for what you know 100% is a lie? This brings up to the last point. And this is a big one. Motive. All the disciples wrote it. They made it up. They just shared it along. They just passed it along. Okay, fine, great. You want to believe that? That's fine. Now, let me ask you, why? What's the motive? What is the motive for lying about this? And again, these aren't guys who are saying, well, we heard the stories from our fathers. No, these are guys who spent the rest of their lives saying, we saw the resurrected Jesus. Okay, fine. If this is a lie, why did they do it? What would they get out of it? Fame. Oh, fame. Yeah, they were popular. They were so popular they were killed by the government. Fortune. Oh yes, fortune. They were broke a lot. They had to live with people. They camped out. There was no mansion on the hilltop. Now that's what they were expecting in the beginning, but that wasn't the reality of their actual situation. They didn't have money. At least enough to what we would say is wealth. It didn't work that way. What was the motive? Prestige and authority. Oh, come on. Remember that list I just gave you about Saul? 5 floggings, 3 beatings, shipwrecks, being dragged out of a street and stoned, poverty, years of ridicule. Okay, now, in order to get this, all you have to do is sign up and say, you're going to tell the story of Jesus. Okay, let's have some volunteers. What's the motive? What is the motive about lying about Jesus? Every single one of them died. And some of them died quite brutally. Not all of them got a quick thrust with a sword like James the Apostle did. A few were crucified. Some were stoned. Some were run through with the spear. But they faced imprisonment and they faced ridicule. This was not a glamour job. There is no motive. There is no earthly motive of continuing the lie of the resurrection if it didn't happen, because from a worldly point of view, the only thing the story of the resurrection got them is heartache, pain, torture, and death. That's it. So why continue the story? Why did the apostles not just quit? It's because they saw the resurrected Lord. That's why. And it changed them to be strong followers. There's a guy by the name of William Lane Craig. He's a debater. And he says, even if the disciples had believed in the resurrection of Jesus, it is doubtful they would have generated any following so long as the body was interred in the tomb. A Christian movement founded on belief in the resurrection of the dead man would have been an impossible folly. Again, all they needed was a body. All they needed was, here's the body of Jesus, now shut up. It didn't happen. But it did happen. It did. The power of the resurrection is life-changing. It's life-altering. It's because we get to look around here and say, you know what? This is not the end of it. This is not the end of it. What God did for Jesus, God is able to do for us. The hope that we have in the resurrection of the Lord who took on every ounce of hatred and cruelty from the world and beat it. That's the hope we have. The power of the resurrection is that we get to look forward. We get to look at this world of sin and darkness and see light and look forward to it and say, one day I'm going to be in the brightness of heaven with my Father. That's the hope we have. It's the hope they had. It's an enduring hope that doesn't get weaker the farther away we get from the resurrection. No. It gets stronger. Because we're longing to go home. Have no doubt Jesus was raised from the dead. Have no doubt that He was seen. Have no doubt that the apostles ate with Him, talked to them, spent time with Him. So it wasn't group hypnosis or a mass hallucination. It happened. Lee Strobel, at the ending of his book, in his book he deals with more than just a resurrection. But at the ending of his book, he talks about how he makes this list. He sat in his house and he made the list. Okay, here's the pros of the evidence of Christ, and here's the negatives. And so he just started writing down. And he's writing. At the end of it, as he's going, he just stops. And he looks at the evidence for versus the evidence against. And the evidence for was blowing the evidence against away. And then he just stopped and looked at what he was doing. And he said, I realized then that it would take more faith to follow atheism than it would be to follow Christ. And that's when he stopped and started believing. I don't know where you are in your spiritual journey. I know some of us might have some questions. Is the Bible reliable? Did the resurrection happen? Did a man named Jesus live? Did He actually die? And so on and so forth, continuing on. I don't know where you are, but what I do know is this. If you have questions, ask. If you have questions, seek it out. If you don't know where to start, I know myself and the elders and the deacons and just more experienced Christians here could point you in a way to go. But what I would entreat you to do is that if you have questions and if you're not sure, search it out. It is that important. C.S. Lewis once said that if Christianity isn't real, it's really of no importance. But if it is real, it is of the utmost importance. The resurrection is real. Jesus came to die, and He lived again. And now we are able to be blessed by that new life ourselves. This morning, if you have not given yourself to Christ, if you have not been buried in baptism, if you have not had your sins washed away, if you have not died to self so that you may live again, which is what the resurrection is about, is what communion is we celebrate. We would love to assist you in that this morning, but whatever needs you have, would you please come down as we stand and as we sing.